Just. All right. So we will begin first with Suzanne Mars.
Before we begin our discussion today, I'm going to ask that we observe a moment of silence in memory of Alice Munro, who died recently at the age of 92. She was a Nobel laureate, a master of the short story genre, and a fellow admirer of Eudora Welty. Let's honor her now. I think one of our future sessions, we might decide to devote to Alice Munro, but before that, let me ask John Hennigan just to say a few words. It was John who suggested that we observe a moment of silence, and I thought it was a wonderful idea. Okay, John.
Thank you, Suzanne. When I saw that Ms. Munro had passed away, what it reminded me of is that she had an entry in Pearl McCanney's book, which the title of which is Eudora Welty, Writer's Reflections Upon First Reading Welty. And I went down at a certain point in my participation in this club, book club. I went down to Lemuria and was going through the works related to Eudora Welty, and this caught my eye because I'd already seen Pearl's name and contribution to these sessions. And when I opened up the table of contents, Alice Munro's name caught my eye for obvious reasons because of her contribution, and she had, by that time, by the time that I discovered the book, which was about 3 years ago, Alice Munro had been awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, and that was just a must read for me. And what she wrote about was golden apples, and she wrote about it both as a reader and as a writer. And she had this description of how reading golden apples to her was it was not only the first book that she had read by Eudora Welty, but it wound up being her most favorite books of all the different publications that Eudora Welty had. And one of the things she noted was that on the blurb of the copy she had read, it said that Eudora Welty creates an entire world in this book. And Alice Munro, wrote about that and what that meant to her. And I'm just going to close with this. The story must be imagined so deeply and devoutly that everything in it seems to bloom of its own accord and to be connected then to our own lives, which suddenly, as we read, take on a hard beauty, a familiar strangeness, the importance of a dream which can't be disputed or explained. Everything is telling you, stop, hold on, here it is, here to remember. You must say, yes, that's it. That's what's been here all the time. And I told Suzanne that a couple of years ago, my wife and I patronized Munro's books in Vancouver, British Columbia, after I had read and reread Golden Apples. And I went there to see what she primarily one, because it's an independent bookstore and I love to go to independent bookstores, but I also went there because I wanted to see what Munro's books had by Eudora Welty. And my recollection is they had Delta Wedding and they had her collected short stories, the paperback with the introduction by Ann Patchett. If Golden Apples had been in stock, I would have purchased it, even though I already had my own copy and then I'd read and reread it And the book staff was very helpful. And before we left, and after a lot of thought, I purchased the Penguin Canada 2006 paperback edition of Miss Monroe's My Best Stories, and which has a sticker on the back of it showing that I purchased it from her bookstore, which I wanted to have before I left. I want to mention one other thing, and then I'll close. After I spoke to Suzanne, I went on the New York Times. I think it was on Wednesday when they finally had an obituary about Alice Munro. And the obituary mentions, among other people, it mentions Ms. Welty. And I want to read just the excerpt from the obituary that was in the New York Times. This is a short paragraph. Like Faulkner, Eudora Welty, and the other Southern writers she admired, Ms. Munro was capable of breathing life into an entire world. For her, the importunate countryside of southwestern Ontario and the placid, occasionally threatening presence of Lake Huron. Cynthia Ozick called her our Chekhov, and the description stuck. And that makes me think of, I happen to think of Ms. Welty as our Chekhov.
She would be honored by that. She loved Chekhov. All right, Anna, we'll turn it
Suzanne,
back.
I'm sorry, may I just ask the first quote that John gave, where is that from? What source is that?
The first quote.
Yeah, not the one from the obituary.
Oh, not the one for, that was from Golden Apples. That was from Ms. Monroe's take on and her critique of Golden Apples and how it influenced her as a writer.
It's
Got
in
it.
your book, I think, Pearl. In your book.
Yes, it's from Writer's Reflections upon First Reading Welty.
Yeah.
It was putting that collection together was just so wonderful. And my editor, Judy Long, encouraged me to invite Alice Munro, who I didn't know. Most of the other writers I had met or knew or had some connection with. So I just wrote this little blind letter, you know, would she like to contribute to this birthday celebration for Welty? And you had to mail it to like the drugstore post office at the corner of some sort of little crossroads. So that's what I did. And then months later, but before the book was ready, I got a telephone call at my office, and the person said, well, this is Alice Munro. And I thought, I had to like jump back into the moment to find out Alice Munro. Okay. Oh, Alice Munro, I'm talking to her. So it was just so lovely. I'll send a link to an essay I wrote about Welty and Munro using that phrase, hard beauty, that we can share next week. I can't go down and find it right now. So
Yeah, that would be great.
I love that story, Pearl. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, John. And thank you, Pearl, for that link. If you want to just send it to info@Eudora Welty House, then I'll make sure it gets distributed. So hello, everybody, and welcome to Welty at Home, the slow reading virtual book club that alternates works by Eudora Welty with works by authors connected to Welty. We are currently exploring E.M. Forster's 1908 novel, A Room with a View. During this series, we will read and discuss about 4 chapters each week between now and June 17th. Just a reminder that we will be taking a break next Monday, May 27th for Memorial Day. I'm Anna Traylor, the education specialist at Eudora Welty House and Garden. We are grateful to our host, Suzanne Mars, Eudora Welty's friend and biographer, and Professor Emerita of Millsaps College for guiding these discussions alongside our guest instructor for the series, Kelly Marsh. Just some quick housekeeping. To comment or ask a question, click the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and select raise hand. If you're on a tablet or a phone, you may have to tap the screen for this option to appear. And a lively discussion often takes place in the chat as well, so be sure to glance over at that chat box every now and then. All right, Kelly, I'll let you take it away.
Good afternoon. So good to see everyone back, and hope you have enjoyed reading through chapter 12, the 12th chapter for today, which we can talk about. Lots of things we talk about today, I think we'll be picking up from things we've expressed interest in before. And if you don't mind, I would like to start with, we've been hearing the name Emerson practically since day one. And a few people, especially Suzanne Mars, have said in the past couple of meetings, we probably need to talk about this name. Well, now in what we've read for today, you'll remember, and if I could just point out on page 106, Lucy has tried to disguise that she met people called Emerson by calling them Harris, but eventually the truth comes, pretty soon the truth comes out. And she's talking to her brother and her mother about the Emersons. And Lucy's mother on 106, just about 8 lines down.
Which chapter, Kelly?
Chapter 10.
I think this is Lucy, actually, Kelly.
Well, let's see. Well, we'll talk about, let me read it and we'll talk about that. I was merely going to remark, Freddie, that I trusted they were no relations of Emerson the philosopher, a most trying man. Pray, does that satisfy you? I could definitely be wrong about who it is. I had the idea that it was the mother, because the mother has been saying, I hope that they're the right sort of people. And now I think she's defending herself by saying, well, what I meant is, I hope they're not like the philosopher Emerson,
You're
but I could be wrong
probably
about
right.
that.
Maybe I read it, and I'm sure you're right.
So now we've had Emerson the philosopher actually referred to specifically. And just to throw in, on page 116, and this is just 2 pages into the 12th chapter, on page 116, Freddie and Mr. Beebe have showed up at the Emerson's house here in Summer Street, their new house, and noticed on the wardrobe has been painted, mistrust all enterprises that require new clothes. And so a quotation from Thoreau. So it seemed like the moment to talk about these references to philosophy. And when Suzanne Mars had brought this up to begin with, at least last time, maybe the time before, she had also mentioned references to Carlyle. So I thought we'd maybe follow that up and make sure we don't skip it over. And Suzanne has agreed to say some thoughts she has about all of that.
All right, so I'll try to not to be my usual long-winded self, but Carlyle in 1833 and 34 in Fraser's magazine first published a work of long fiction. It was serialized, called Sartor Resartus. And in this piece, he depicts the character, and my German is horrible, but Teufelsdruck, who moves from the everlasting nay through the center of indifference to embracing the everlasting yea. So he moves from a nihilistic kind of despair to an embracing of life. He resolves to protest against a life of insecurity and to create himself, to define and act on his own talents, to create a meaningful existence. And Mr. Emerson sets forth this hope for his son on pages 25 and 26 in our book, which is the end of chapter 2. So Mr. Emerson says to Lucy, in an ordinary voice, so that she scarcely realized he was quoting poetry, he said, and he's quoting Houseman, from even morning and yon 12-winded sky, the stuff of life to knit me blew hither, here am I. George and I both know this, but why does it distress him? We know that we come from the winds and that we shall return to them, that all life is perhaps a knot, a tangle, a blemish in the internal smoothness. But why should this make us unhappy? Let us rather love one another and work and rejoice. I don't believe in this world sorrow. Miss Honeychurch assented. Then make my boy think like us. Make him realize that by the side of the everlasting, why, there is a yes, a transitory yes, if you will, but a yes, the everlasting yea. So there's the reference to Carlyle. And of course, George at the end of chapter 4 says to Lucy says to him, how quickly these accidents do happen. They've seen the murder. And then one returns to the old life. He says, I don't. Anxiety moved her to question him. His answer was puzzling. I shall probably want to live. But why, Mr. Emerson? What do you mean? I shall want to live, I say. So there is George embracing the everlasting yea. Carlyle, of course, was a friend of Emerson's, and they met in August of 1833 before Sardis was published. And Emerson, in fact, arranged to have it published as a book in the United States before it was published in England. So Emerson was responsible for the book publication, original book publication. So they were friends, alike in many ways, different in many others. But Forster, of course, alludes much more directly to Emerson. He calls Emerson by name than he does to Carlyle. And I think there are two key concepts from Emerson that he is wanting to call to our attention. One is the notion of self-trust. In his essay, The American Scholar, which was called the American Intellectual Declaration of Independence, in The American Scholar, Emerson wrote that, in self-trust, all the virtues are comprehended. Free should the scholar be, free and brave, free even to the definition of freedom without a hindrance that does not arise out of his own constitution. And then the other concept from Emerson, I think, is a concept that's known as correspondence. And again, this is in The American Scholar, where Emerson says, the American scholar shall see that nature is the opposite of the soul, answering to it part for part. One is seal and one is print. Its beauty is the beauty of his own mind. Its laws are the laws of his own mind. Nature then becomes to him the measure of his attainments. So much of nature as he is ignorant of, so much of his own mind does he not yet possess. And in fine, the ancient precept, know thyself, and the modern precept, study nature, become at last one maxim. Emerson also famously wrote years later, the axioms of physics translate the laws of ethics. So the axioms of physics translate the laws of ethics. And I think that all of these concepts, both of these concepts are prevalent. Lucy's need to discover her freedom, George's recognition of his freedom to choose life, to create himself, and then Cecil's wanting to bring Lucy into nature, but not knowing anything about it, and the whole idea of the sacred lake and the immersing the men, and Lucy's been in the sacred lake too, and that of being allied with nature and the natural world rather than of having a view rather than being defined by the room as she sees Cecil. So those are my thoughts on that. And I think we can go lots of other places.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Probably other people in the group have been sitting on some thoughts about Emerson, maybe Carlyle. That was something that Suzanne taught me. But does anybody want to add things about Emerson, or branch out into talking about the Emersons, if you like?
Looks like there's Monica.
I
and
do.
Vic.
Oh, no, go ahead. Monica.
I just think it's funny that Lucy's mother thinks that philosophers such as Emerson are the wrong kind of people. So that sets up, as we're setting up at the right and wrong inside a room versus nature. I love that, according to Lucy's mom, if he'd been related to the philosopher Emerson, that would have been bad.
Joe Ellman.
Thanks. I just want to point out generally that we, as we talk today and go through this section, keep an eye on reading. Who's reading? We know from Mrs. Harris, the allusion to Dickens, that Lucy makes, that it's not like she hasn't read. Cecil Weiss wants to make her a reader, make him read his books, apparently. But the mother thinks it's Thackeray. We see when Freddie visits, when the Emersons have just moved in, everything on their bookshelves that they've been reading, and George reads in German. So I just want to hang that out there for right now.
Pearl.
I just would remind us that transcendentalism of, Carlyle and specifically Emerson and Thoreau is a part of Romanticism. So there's that passage I read last time about, stopping the reality and the unreality that's so much like Hawthorne's beginning, but also chapter 12 and the fourth and the 12th chapter have these incredible transcendental moments. Maybe today we would call them epiphanies, but there really are transcendental moments when they are like Virgie going into the river, where everything changes, or the reality drops away and they find a new reality. They transcend this world, kind of thing.
Very interesting, everybody. And I thought that would lead us to say just a word or two, at least, about a question we had about whether who can help Lucy on her road to discovery of what she's trying to discover, of originally the true Italy or herself or something else, who can help her. And we had a question whether it was Mr. Beebe who could help her. And of course, we're being asked to consider whether Mr. Emerson can help her. And it seems like Mr. Emerson's more hopeful romanticist view is maybe, I think, being championed here a little bit more than Mr. Beebe's ironic distance. And I thought about that again because of the way that Pearl phrased that, but also because Joellen mentioned who's reading what. And when Freddie and Mr. Beebe walk into the Emerson's house and see what they're reading, some of the things that the Emersons are reading are actually unfamiliar to Mr. Beebe. So even though he's intellectual and knowledgeable, they're a step ahead. So I thought that was something noticeable from the reading today. So since Pearl mentioned about the 4th chapter and the 12th chapter, and we've been talking about that since day one, about how almost all the chapters are given very clearly descriptive names, mostly in the voices that the characters, in the language that the characters tend to use, mostly. Should we talk about what chapter 4, the 4th chapter and the 12th chapter have in common that might have made Forster want to title them differently? Want to, or have to, or something?
There's Pearl and Harriet.
Well, first, what I already mentioned, that there are these transcendental moments that we experience them as sort of gifts or openings ourselves. But also, those are the chapters where Lucy and George are together. Lucy just for a moment, but she doesn't seem to be too worried about seeing George at that moment. So that's just the other thing I thought was in common.
One thing I think is surprising is that the chapter in which Lucy and George kiss is not one of those. But okay, Harriet?
Yeah, I guess I was going to say they are both kind of epiphany chapters. They are chapters that that are central to the story. They are I want to say death and nature and body is something are important in both. I've been thinking about the titles actually, and I was thinking about Lucy as a work of art and versus my wanting to, vis-a-vis something Monica said last time, be looking for Lucy as artist rather than Lucy as work of art. But I am thinking about the push and pull between a culture that wants to write her as work of art, and her finding her way. Cecil's going to say that her face was inartistic when she begins to have a face of a peevish virago. And I'm well on my way to finding Lucy a much more complex character than are those in previous chapters, as she is finding her point of view and finding her way to resist in any number of ways in these chapters.
Monica.
Thank you, Harriet. I wanted to actually point out another place where we see Lucy being an artist in chapter 12. Where so in chapter 12, she makes a reference to the murder on 66. She says, you know, once by the river, oh, but he isn't killed. But it's the next page where she says at the top of 67, when she's talking about when she kissed George, I had silly thoughts. The sky, you know, was gold and the ground all blue, and for a moment he looked like someone in a book. So again, books are really key here. And then heroes, gods, the nonsense of schoolgirls. But then later on the page, she says, the luxury of self-exposure kept her almost happy through the long evening. She thought not so much of what had happened as of how she should describe it. All her sensations, her spasms of courage, her moments of unreasonable joy, her mysterious discontent should be carefully laid before her cousin, and together in divine confidence they would disentangle and interpret them all. At last, thought she, I shall understand myself. So I love this page because we're getting, again, it's not so much experience is important, but also like how that experience changes you and how you understand it seems to be even more important, which seems to be, on the one hand, part of Lucy as artist, but also, you know, the notion of experience, tourism being one kind of experience, but this having an experience, but then it also changes you, becomes part of you, related to these transcendental moments that we've been talking about.
Beverly?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm on a different computer, but I'm still having computer problems. In chapter 10, I had marked this when I was reading about Lucy kind of becoming evolved, whereas we see her when she's in Italy, when she's easily led and all. But on page 103, when the title of the chapter is Cecil as humorist, but, you know, Italy quickens Cecil not to tolerance, but to irritation, and society is narrow, et cetera, et cetera. Then you get down to the bottom of that paragraph, and we hear, nor did he realize a more important point, that if she was too great for this society, she was too great for all society, and had reached the stage where personal intercourse would alone satisfy her. A rebel she was, but not of the kind he understood. A rebel who desired not a wider dwelling room, but equality beside the man she loved. For Italy was offering her the most priceless of all possessions, her own soul. And that reminded me of, so, you know, women's literature, you know, during this time when we have people like, you know, Kate Chopin writing about women who are trying to find some kind of voice in a society that did not want them to have a voice, or they wanted them to be subjugated to their husband or their father, whoever that was. So I, you know, when I read that, I thought, well, you know, Lucy's going to come out. You know, Lucy's probably gonna be okay because she's looking for her soul.
Yeah.
Very interesting. I'm glad in the things that have been said, we've been making sure that we also quote some of the very funny things, like Beverly at the beginning of that paragraph. Italy had quickened Cecil to irritation. That's funny. And Harriet was quoting about Lucy as a peevish virago. I'm glad we're quoting the funny things and looking at how they're just stacked right up against the philosophical things. And so from the beginning, we've been kind of saying, can Lucy discover the true Italy? And a number of you talked about that in the chat last time. Like Judith saying, well, if you can't speak Italian, you're never listened to it. If you can't speak Italian and you never really listen to Italians, you're not going to find the real Italy, just for example. But can she find Italy? Can she find herself, like in her soul? But also, what else can she find? And I think that what Beverly just read gets to some of it. One thing that she's trying to find is an idea of interpersonal relations that includes equality. And then another thing I think also that's in what Beverly just read is, if she doesn't find Italy, she comes back to, and one of you, I think I'm quoting one of you almost exactly from last time. She comes back to England, or maybe I think what I'm quoting actually is later in this book. She comes back to England and sees England differently. And so she sees, when Beverly just read, if she was too great for this society, she was too great for all society. One thing she's too great for now is to maybe, or at least maybe on her way to, is to having everyone dictate who she should be able to associate with based on social class, or some other kinds of not quite defined social criteria. And I think this is definitely connected to Monica's point about her exploring herself as an artist, and that connects to Beverly's characterization of her as learning to be a rebel. So all those things I think are coming together in all of that. Bill?
Yeah, I wish I could contribute something that's really interesting, but just a couple observations. And I don't have the same edition you guys have, but it's in chapter 9, I believe. And this is when Cecil's trying to take her off the road. And he says to her, I had got an idea, I dare say wrongly, that you feel more at home with me in a room. A room, she echoed, hopelessly bewildered. Yes, or at the most in a garden or on a road, never in the real country like this. Oh, Cecil, whatever do you mean? I have never felt anything of the sort. You talk as if I was some kind of poetess sort of person. I don't know that you aren't. I connect you with a view, a certain type of view. Why shouldn't you connect me with a room? She reflected for a moment and then said, laughing, you know that you're right. I do. I must be a poetess after all. When I think of you, it's always as in a room. How funny. To her surprise, he seemed annoyed. A drawing room, pray, with no view? Yes, with no view. Now, I thought that was really interesting. It's probably obvious to all you guys, but the title of this is A Room with a View. And the way that this opened was that George was offering her a room with a view. And so it's just kind of an interesting connection. And then, when she encountered George and he kissed her, she had tumbled into that nature, shall we say. And here she's encountering George again. She hadn't encountered him again, but he has tumbled into that sacred lake. And she's the nature that she's encountering are a bunch of guys playing around stark naked and having fun, And the other thing that struck me was that section that was just read, for Italy was offering her the most priceless of all possessions, her own soul. The very next sentence is playing bumble puppy with Minnie Beebe, right? So her own soul goes right into playing, And so I just, those two little connections really kind of struck me. So.
Great. Harry?
I was just thinking now to build on Bill, I was thinking about the moment when George says, you can call it fate, but you can call it Italy if it makes you less unhappy. But it's fate. Fate and Italy become interchangeable. But I was also thinking about Cecil in this scene, and Cecil throughout as a character who both is interesting because he both knows his limitations and articulates them, feels disappointment in himself, and also has no idea about himself in other moments where he thinks he's an egalitarian and talks about democracy and Lucy shakes her head. But he's complicated and articulate. I was thinking too about your saying last time, Kelly, about the difference between articulate and silent in this book. And he has lots of words, but Lucy still maybe have fewer words. Well, I take that back, because I think she finds her voice in, say, the letter to Miss Bartlett, or in her opposition to Cecil, when she realizes that in his effort to be a cosmopolitan naughty, he has bested her. He has undermined her, and so. But it is interesting that he is articulate both about his own limitations, his failure at the kiss, his failure to be part of the natural world, his longing to be that other, and his own misunderstanding about who he is.
Pearl.
I do not like Cecil. I'm just going to say it. And in the beginning of chapter 11,
Wait till the end.
I'm hesitant to think which character is played by him. I don't want to know about the movie. We're not watching it till the end. But sort of toward the beginning of chapter 11, in Miss Vyse's well-appointed flat, Cecil too became demonstrative. He saw that the needful fire had been kindled in Lucy. At last she longed for attention, as a woman should, and looked up to him because he was a man. It's like, I just want to hit him. Sorry. I think that's funny in a sense, but I just don't get him. I don't like him. Sorry. I mean, he is. Who has seen the fire in Lucy? Mr. Beebe so far, and obviously George. Okay, that's it. Nothing wise, just
Joe Ellen and then Monica.
In Lucy as a work of art, in my text, page 93, we see that even though he says Lucy has been engaging in a muscular rant, the vitality showed that she was alive. So it shows him just a little bit recognizing that life, but he's a fool. And he does, like on page 93, it's hilarious. He wants her to get into nature, the simplest of topics, a phrase that bites him on the butt by the end of this section, you may recall. And Lucy, I believe, the narrator's a tricky thing in this novel, but I think that we're supposed to realize that Lucy is the one understanding that he really he's not familiar with the natural world, and he went wrong. And in the last paragraph in that page, I count myself a lucky person. When I'm in London, I feel I could never live out of it. When I'm in the country, I feel the same about the country. That's a direct echo of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, her kind of blithe, relatively superficial character. But basically, this is George getting her into the woods, which he doesn't understand at all. And this is the lead up to his kiss, which, as we just heard, goes sadly awry. So that he's really foolish in nature. He's just talking, doesn't know what he's saying either way.
Monica and then Susan.
So I admit Cecil is hard to take, but because I came to this from the movie, where my husband and I got into an argument because Mark did not believe that was Daniel Day-Lewis, and it just shows what an incredible actor Daniel Day-Lewis is, because Mark's like, that is not Last of the Mohicans guy. And he is so uptight, but he has this kind of sympathy, or he evokes in me this kind of sympathy. And this paragraph in Lucy as a Work of Art, where he's going over what happened, I feel sympathy for Cecil here. He is totally all the things y'all are saying, but he considered with truth that it had been a failure. Passion should believe itself irresistible. It should forget civility and consideration and all of the other curses of a refined nature. Above all, it should never ask for leave where there is a right of way. Why could he not do as any laborer or navvy, nay, as any young man behind the counter would have done? So this is, George or Cecil going, why can't I be like the poets and all of that? You know, I've read about this in books, which is another, you know, perspective here of the books is Cecil's like, why isn't this like it is in books? And then I think that's fascinating where it says he recast the scene. So he then kind of uses his own kind of artistic something or other to recast the scene with Lucy standing flower-like by the water. So then he kind of like recovers himself and turns back into Cecil. Lucy was standing flower-like by the water. He rushed up and took her in his arms. She rebuked him, permitted him, and revered him even after for his manliness, for he believed that women revere men for their manliness. I think this paragraph is such a fascinating insight into Cecil, and it makes me feel a little bit of sympathy for him going, I'm trying to be like everything I've read in books. How come it isn't like what I see in books? I went to nature.
Okay, Susan.
Yeah, I'm stuck in this chapter also. When Cecil is thinking about Lucy, but Italy worked some marvel in her. It gave her light, and which he held more precious, it gave her shadow. Soon he detected in her a wonderful reticence. She was like a woman of Leonardo da Vinci's, whom we love not so much for herself as for the things that she will not tell us. The things are assuredly not of this life. No woman of Leonardo's could ever have anything so vulgar as a story. She did develop most wonderfully day by day. And it really, I mean, it just shows us, Cecil's whole way of looking at and trying to get into this kind of theory of art criticism, I guess, or this mode of art criticism, and yet not really apprehend the essential Lucy, who, if she's alive, will have some sort of plot, we hope.
Bill and then Harriet.
I was going to quote from the exact paragraph from chapter 8 because it's the only one that gives me any kind of sympathy for Cecil, in that he recognized the wonderful changes that were beginning in Lucy before anybody that knew her did. You know, he had known her before. Now, it wasn't, he didn't have a deep knowledge of her either before or after, but he did see her changing and did see her becoming greater. So I thought, okay, yeah, there's something about this guy that, he at least recognizes quality, shall we say. And I'm just disappointed that about herself not recognizing herself early enough so that she could meet George, shall we say, but earlier. I assume she's going to end up with him. I hope this is a happy book. So anyway.
Harriet?
Yeah, I wonder about the Leonardo because at moments he seems to be imposing that on her. And I'm just wondering about the illusions and how we pan them out. But my particular questions, I'm going back to the idea of Lucy as artist and her music, because I think that I had originally understood her music in terms of a cultured woman who plays a little piano and who's very good at it, and we see this quality in her. But now I'm beginning to think, no, that there's more to her relationship to music. And I'm thinking about this scene in which she plays Schumann and how to read it. So Cecil says, now some Beethoven, where the querulous beauty of the music had died. She shook her head and played Schumann again. The melody rose, unprofitably magical. It broke. It was resumed broken, not marching once from the cradle to the grave. The sadness of the incomplete, the sadness that is often life, but should never be art, throbbed in its dejected phases and made the phrases and made the nerves of the audience throb. Not thus had she played on the little draped piano at the Bertolino, and too much Schumann was not a remark that Mr. Beebe had passed to himself when she returned. He knows that he and his mother go on about how wonderful Lucy is in her music. But the movement from Beethoven to Schumann, and whether I read it as, now I'm kind of reaching, but I'm thinking, is it that she's interpreting the brokenness of this episode in their lives, the sadness of the incomplete, that we understand her development through what she chooses to play in this passage. But maybe somebody else has an idea about Schumann versus Beethoven.
Monica?
You know, Harriet, you're making me think, because looking at that, music is a very bodily art. I mean, you point out in this passage that it causes the sadness of the incomplete throbbed and its disjected phrases. And maybe part of what positions Lucy as more capable of the transcendent experience is because music does kind of involve your body in a way that maybe painting has got some distance to it. Because this section that we read for today is very much, I mean, obviously all about the body. You have Mr. Emerson and Mr. Beebe arguing about men and women, arguing about the Garden of Eden, about Mr. Emerson saying that we can enter the Garden of Eden when we no longer despise our bodies. And then, you know, the fabulous Sacred Lake scene, both Lucy and Cecil, and then the men at the Sacred Lake. So maybe that's part of what music is doing. I certainly don't know how to contrast Schumann and Beethoven, but it may be the bodily nature of music going on.
I don't know if you happen to see, but there was a New York Times article called "Why Do We Make Music?" Just this weekend, where it talked a little bit about theories that present it as something in human nervous system, but connected to the body.
No, I'll look for that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Joellen?
In this same chapter, Mrs. Weiss's well-appointed flat, toward the bottom of page 113, is where Mrs. Weiss is saying, make Lucy one of us. And that's the core of their discussion that's surrounded by these comments on music. And if you'll recall, Mr. Emerson said to Lucy, make George think like us. Two very different propositions and desires for their children. But Lucy's playing Schumann now, not Beethoven, which was energetic and fiery. And Mr. Beebe said that she'd had too much Beethoven whenever he didn't quite understand where she was going, etc. And even though Cecil calls out for Beethoven, he doesn't understand what's happening at all. That Lucy, this is not a good experience for Lucy. The melody broke, she's not playing it even well. And she wouldn't play Beethoven for him. But on the very next page, he's telling his mother how Schumann was the thing. It was wonderful. Lucy's improving as a player, etc., etc. So there's a complete disconnect of who Lucy really is, which is so far come out in relation to music, though she's starting to get more verbal. And that narrator I mentioned at the bottom of page 113, we're told that, or wherever it is, middle of 113, too much Schumann was not the remark that Mr. Beebe had passed to himself when she returned, which gives us a hint that Schumann is not Beethoven. The narrator is impinging. And in fact, at the beginning of Lucy as a work of art, on the very first page, the narrator says, I believe, inserts him or herself. And that happens more than once. And I believe is probably the narrator who calls George, before he gets into the pond, Michelangelesque. So there's a reference there too of George as a work of art, at least to the narrator. Now Lucy wouldn't even been around at that point. So the narrator is speaking to us here and having a great deal of fun. This narrator has lots of fun with us and with all of his characters. But I do think that the Schumann-Beethoven thing is the heart of that chapter.
Beverly?
I thought too, it was we see Lucy moving toward being more independent, and here she is, she's sitting and playing, and people are, I mean, she's not at a tip bar, where people are throwing money at her. She is performing and entertaining, and so he's trying to change the direction of the narrative by having her play something else. But it's not long after this that she feels disrespects her by going behind her back and inviting the Emersons. And she gets very, very angry about that. So I think this is more of her evolution toward being independent and toward, whether it's the difference in Schumann being soothing and Beethoven being fiery, it's her choice. She's the one sitting on the bench. And this is I think it's more indication of her moving toward her own sense of self and finding her soul and being independent, and telling him, don't go behind my back when I have already written the little old ladies to mention the house.
Among the things that Beverly just said, she's pointing out that Lucy refuses Cecil's request. So Bill a second ago said, I hope this is going to be a happy novel. And I think one of the many ways that Forster keeps us understanding that we're in a comic plot is that we know from the beginning that Lucy doesn't have trouble saying no to Cecil. And so we can definitely dislike Cecil, like Pearl says, or find moments where he is redeemable, like Monica found one. But in the end, the danger of Cecil is contained because we're in a comic plot. And I think that connects with what a lot of you have been saying about story. So Susan had read the line about the reason that Leonardo da Vinci woman is appealing is that she doesn't have a story. Then Harriet said that Cecil is trying to impose a story on her, and that's for sure. And then Beverly also just brought up how the chapter that's called about the comic muse, which again calls attention to the idea of a plot sort of exerting itself. And I think all of this is connected and is related to a couple of things, interesting things that got said in the chat last time about what we didn't hear between part 1 and part 2. I thought that Liz really summed it up really well in the chat last time. So we leave Lucy and leaving Florence, and then suddenly she's at Windy Corner. So what did we miss? And Liz said we missed Rome and the Alps. Lucy, all of Lucy's impressions of Cecil and Lucy's first 2 rejections of Cecil, which and people had different interpretations of that. Melissa had written it's because she had been shocked out of stopping her quest for the true Italy. So there was nothing more to see here. Or I think Liz had said, we're not getting her feelings about this anymore. But where I'm headed is that Laura said, with that, why does Lucy accept Cecil in England and she wouldn't accept him in Italy? And I think there's probably lots of possibilities for that, but maybe one of them is, I wonder to what extent Lucy is aware of certain kinds of plots being imposed on her and not wanting to sort of give in. Is there a plot about an English girl going to Italy and being awakened that she's resisting? Resisting by not being willing to fall in love with George, resisting by saying no to Cecil twice. This is just a thought, and maybe something to maybe keep in mind as you watch her decisions from this point on. Is she trying to resist having a certain kind of story? Does she know what kind of story to put in its place if she's able to resist? So that's just some thoughts I had, considering the kinds of things that you all were saying. Right. And so Joellen had something she had already wanted to say, and then Harriet, maybe in response to some of this.
I forgot to mention in regard to the Mrs. Weiss's apartment section that in the section where we're just describing Schumann, Lucy is the one aware of the sadness of the incomplete, the sadness that is often life, but should never be art. And she, at the end of this chapter, a page later, wakes up in a nightmare where darkness then envelops the flat. This is so, remember the darkness in a passage to India. Darkness means something in Forster. And this is just before chapter 12 opens, which is eventful. But Lucy, something's happening in Lucy.
Well, that line actually is, Mrs. Weiss says bad dreams, and she says, no, just dreams. And now I'm thinking about, what does that mean, to have Lucy in the night dreaming? And I'm not sure it's a nightmare. But I was also thinking about, and now I've lost my train of thought. Oh, truthfulness. I was thinking about how back when she and Charlotte have their conversation in an earlier chapter about what has happened to her in chapter 4 and in the 4th chapter. And she says it's so hard to be truthful. And now there's discussion of her truthfulness as she has tried to call the Emersons Harris to obscure them. There's that line where she mentions the Emersons to Cecil, and the narrator says Cecil didn't know that this was the most intimate conversation that they have had, that we ever had. That we're beginning to develop this theme about truthfulness, and whether is it that Lucy is resisting something and that is happening to her, and also lying about it because it too much fits the plot that Kelly's suggesting she's also resisting.
Bill?
Yeah, I'm not going to try to answer any of the questions that were raised. They're excellent questions. I just wanted to point out a couple things. One, on the very beginning of chapter 9, and since I don't have your edition, I can't tell you what your page number is. The second paragraph, Cecil was more than presentable. He looked distinguished, and it was very pleasant to see his slim figure keeping step with Lucy and his long, fair face responding when Lucy spoke to him. People congratulated Mrs. Honeychurch, which is, and this is the question I have, I believe, a social blunder. Who is the I here? I mean, it's the first time I've noticed that I, and so it's not Mrs. Honeychurch. But one of the reasons I ask in the same chapter that we're talking about, 11th chapter, right before, she's going to play the piano, it's a couple paragraphs up, it says, from when she's responded to the letter, she says, secrecy has this disadvantage. We lose the sense of proportion. We cannot tell whether our secret is important or not. Were Lucy and her cousin closeted with the great thing, which would destroy Cecil's life if he discovered it, or with a little thing, which he would laugh at? Who's the we? I mean, am I now part of the narrator thing? I mean, I'm not a writer, so I don't know how you do these things. But then in the very next paragraph, when he's describing the cousins that are the grandchildren of the famous people, one was tired of everything, it seemed. One launched into enthusiasms only to collapse gracefully and pick oneself up amid sympathetic laughter. In this atmosphere, the Pincione, Bertolini, and Windy Corner appeared equally crude. And this is what I think is interesting. And Lucy saw that her London career could estrange her a little from all that she had loved in the past. So that one and the oneself, who are these ones and oneselves? Is this the narrator again? So I don't know these kind of things, and just seemed interesting to see them.
Suzanne, may I say something? If we keep it strictly to Southern literature, there's a short story that I want to post about on the Faulkner Book Club about stuff like this. But I also wanted to give a shout out to Pearl and Tom, because Tom has been, his publications have been featured recently on our page. So thank you very much for that. to me, being new to literature, the daughter and going to the lighthouse, the one who like leapt up in the air and caught something, she's a new independent woman to me. And the young lady who was stuck with the younger brother, she's a new young lady to me. So you all are English professors, and I feel like you're building all of this up to us to understand one thing in particular.
Thanks, Cheryl. I'm glad to see you down there on the bottom of my screen. Kelly, you want to close us out before Anna does? Yeah, then Anna's going to take over and shut us down, I'm afraid.
Sure. I guess I would just say, I think Bill's noticed some interesting things. So keep your eye on that narrator who likes to shift back and forth between one and I, but mostly seems like a distant third person, etc. And keep looking out for references to rooms and views, and maybe we'll start there next time.
All right, cool.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you everyone for being a part of our discussion today. Thank you again to Suzanne Mars and to Kelly Marsh and MDAH and the Eudora Welty Foundation for allowing us to continue this Welty at Home tradition. A quick reminder again that we will not meet next week on Monday, May 27th for a Memorial Day break. And we will see each other again Monday, June 3rd to discuss chapters 13 through, is that 16?
Yes.
16, yes. Okay, perfect. Great, awesome. Thank you guys so much. Have a great one.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end it. Thank you guys.